Imagine you are standing among the dead on the windswept hills of the Little Bighorn battlefield in Montana. The air is heavy with gunpowder and silence. Around you lie the relics of the fallen, torn uniforms, broken rifles, and the weathered badges of the 7th Cavalry, who fought with their last breath, believing they were defending a nation destined to rule the West. But as you stand there, holding the rusted fragments of their story, you can almost feel the ghosts of history whispering. Because the same land that swallowed them now bears witness to the consequences of promises broken, echoes of betrayal, greed, and the misunderstood policies that still shape America today. They say Custer's last stand was over in under 2 hours. But what no one tells you is that in that hours, more than 260 men were erased from existence, their bodies left so mutilated that many couldn't be recognized, even by their brothers. When the burial parties arrived 2 days later, the air was thick with decay, and the ground shimmered with thousands of spent shells. Yet the real story isn't just about how they died, but why they shouldn't have been there at all. Because behind that hour of blood lies a century of betrayal, arrogance, and broken treaties. So ask yourself, was this really Custer's last stand, or justice catching up to empire? What if the Battle of the Little Bighorn was never supposed to happen? What if the so-called massacre that shocked America in 1876 was actually the result of a lie, a chain of orders built on greed for gold buried beneath sacred land? Imagine this. Custer's men were told they'd be facing only a few hundred warriors. In reality, thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho stood ready, united in defense of their homeland. So what if the story you've always heard, the brave soldiers ambushed by savages, was just the cover for one of the greatest miscalculations in U.S. military history? Through the eyes of history itself, we return to the Little Bighorn to uncover what truly happened that day. On June 25, 1876, 5 companies of the 7th U.S. Cavalry rode into legend under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. None of them would ride back. The combined forces of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall, met them with unrelenting resistance. The battle itself lasted only a few hours, but the aftermath would echo for days, months, and generations. What survivors and investigators later found amid the smoke and blood told a story of desperation, vengeance, and a cruelty that seared itself into America's memory. White Wolf, a Northern Cheyenne warrior, walked among the corpses the day after the battle. What he remembered most were not just the horrors, but the strange details. Young warriors and even children scavenged through pockets and boots, pulling out square green paper money and laughing at its uselessness on the prairie. Some of those bills became blankets for toy horses made of mud. Others were kept as curiosities. Silver coins were hammered into buckles and ornaments, trophies to be worn proudly back in the village. Whiskey flasks, still half full, were passed around among warriors. Little Hawk and Wooden Leg both recalled the sharp, burning bite of the troopers' liquor, how the taste drew laughter, then blame, as some said the soldiers' erratic behavior in battle was due to that very whiskey. These relics, money, buckles, bottles, tell a second story about that day, the story of what the victors took home. When the cavalry's relief columns reached the site on June 27th, horror struck them silent. Captain Tom Custer, George's younger brother, was found face down, his skull shattered, arrows grotesquely protruding from his back and head. One arrowhead was buried deep in bone. Nearly all his hair had been torn away, save for a small tuft clinging at the nape of his neck. George Custer himself lay oddly serene on his back, hands folded over his abdomen, a posture those who knew him said was familiar, as if he had simply fallen asleep. He bore 2 fatal wounds, one to the temple and one near the heart. Yet his body, unlike so many others, had not been mutilated. Boston Custer, the youngest brother, was discovered about 200 yards away, stripped of clothing except for his white cotton socks, whose maker's labels had been carefully cut away. Across that field, names stitched into uniforms were sliced out, personal effects stolen, and identities erased. The burial parties faced a task that no soldier's training could ever prepare them for. With only a few spades, a handful of axes, several picks, and improvised tools like knives and tin cups, they scraped shallow graves into the dry soil. The work was brutal and hurried. The summer sun baked the bodies, flies swarmed, and scavengers circled. One trumpeter in that grim detail, Giuseppe Martini, later described a ravine filled with corpses piled one atop another, a scene so monstrous that men struggled to put it into words. Martini also found a first sergeant covered in torn scraps of paper money, $500 entrusted to him for safekeeping, now shredded and scattered over his broken body. Some of the mutilations were surgical in their horror. Scalps hacked away, skin flaps still attached, heads crushed open, bodies slashed and burned. Adjutant Cook's sideburns had been scalped, the skin left dangling like a rope. Scout George Herendeen reported seeing 4 severed heads in the Sioux camp, trophies, their bodies never recovered. Lieutenant Charles Rowe of the 2nd Cavalry described a white man's head tied to a lariat and dragged through the village until the rope finally snapped free from the neck. Survivor Jacob Adams later testified that some captives were burned alive. Troopers tied to trees and set alight, acts witnessed helplessly by men of Benteen's division who were too far away to intervene. John Ryan, another member of the burial detail, recalled finding bones and fragments of blue cloth at places where men had been lashed to stakes. These stories, grim, disputed, and raw, became part of the wider narrative of vengeance and retribution that surrounded the battle. Only one guidon from Custer's command survived. The small swallow-tailed flag was found pinned beneath the body of Corporal John Foley, who had tried to escape on horseback, but, pursued by warriors, chose to shoot himself rather than be captured. Sergeant Ferdinand Culbertson of the burial party discovered the blood-stained flag beneath Foley's corpse. That cloth, later called the Culbertson Guidon, would become one of the most haunting relics of that day, a silent witness to the desperate final stand. Over a century later, it resurfaced at auction and in 2010 sold for $2.2 million, turning a tattered piece of history into a headline and reigniting old debates about memory, ownership, and the price of remembrance. You can watch the full story behind this legendary flag in our video, The $2.2 Million Secret Flag Buried Beneath the Guidon Body, a haunting chapter from America's most infamous battlefield. The link is waiting for you in the description below. Reno and Benteen, 2 names forever linked to the questions left behind by Little Bighorn. Major Marcus Reno led an initial charge that some described as courageous, others as disastrous. He pushed into the timber along the river, struck a portion of the encampment, then withdrew under heavy fire, rallying his men into a defensive position. Critics called it cowardice or failure of leadership. Defenders pointed to confusion, lack of reinforcements, and overwhelming numbers. Captain Frederick Benteen, meanwhile, had been sent to scout and support, though his orders that day were vague, open to multiple interpretations. Benteen eventually moved to assist Captain McDougall and later joined Reno's force, forming a skirmish line and enduring repeated assaults from warriors. He heard the distant volleys and cries from the ridge where Custer had gone forward, echoes of a battle he could not see, yet could not forget. Benteen's men later spoke of the agony of hearing but not being able to help, the horror of knowing their comrades were dying within earshot. Those who survived Reno's retreat and Benteen's defense returned home, changed men. Many refused to speak of what they had seen. Others poured their torment into letters, maps, sketches, and testimonies, trying to make sense of the senseless. The Army launched inquiries, officers gave testimony, newspapers printed accusations. Custer was called reckless, Reno cowardly, Benteen, insubordinate. The truth remained elusive, clouded by chaos, misread commands, and a terrain that swallowed clarity as surely as it did the dead. Decades later, archaeology began to tell its own story. After wildfires swept through the prairie in the 1980s, researchers unearthed thousands of artifacts, cartridge cases, buttons, belt buckles, and twisted rifle barrels. Each piece helped map the choreography of battle, where soldiers made their stands, where volleys erupted, where horses collapsed in heaps. The earth, it turned out, had preserved what the living could not. For Native communities, the story remained deeply human. Oral histories passed through Lakota and Cheyenne families told of decades of broken treaties, stolen lands, and settlers flooding into the Black Hills Hills, a sacred place to their people. Many elders explained that the mutilations, often condemned by outsiders, were rooted in spiritual beliefs or vengeance rituals meant to prevent an enemy's return. Rain in the Face's name was whispered in both fear and reverence. Among Native descendants, the Battle of the Little Bighorn was remembered not as an act of savagery, but as a desperate stand for survival, a fight to preserve a way of life. In the years that followed, memory itself became contested ground. Relic hunters scavenged the site, artifacts were bought and sold. Museums displayed uniforms and weapons, raising questions of dignity and exploitation. Laws were eventually passed to protect the battlefield and those buried there. In 1879, soldiers reinterred many of the remains in a communal grave atop what became known as Last Stand Hill. White marble markers now dot the landscape, though their placements are often only approximate. Beneath them lie identities more hopeful than certain. Today, visitors walk those ridges at the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. Some pause in quiet reflection, others trace bullet patterns that mark where men made their final stands. Descendants of both soldiers and warriors sometimes gather in uneasy reconciliation, each remembering differently, each unwilling to let the other's version erase their own. That tension keeps the story alive. When the wind moves through the grass on Last Stand Hill, it still seems to whisper. The artifacts that surface from the soil do not settle debates. And listen carefully, they raise new questions in silence. Why did Custer advance as he did? Why did Reno retreat? Did Benteen follow orders or interpret them? Historians will argue for years to come. These artifacts are the quiet witnesses that refuse to be forgotten. They called it Custer's Last Stand, but for the Lakota and Cheyenne, it was something else entirely, the day the earth itself struck back. History painted them as savages, yet who were the real savages? Those defending their homeland, or those invading it for gold? The truth buried beneath Little Bighorn is uncomfortable, but maybe that's why it still matters. Because the story of conquest always ends the same way, until we learn to listen to the voices it tried to silence. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more interesting videos like this, to learn about the past in the history. Thanks for watching.